Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name's Johnny. I work at the Authors Guild, and this event is produced by the Authors Guild Foundation, our charitable arm that advocates for writers and puts on educational programming such as this. This is the first event in our annual series, From Manuscript to Marketplace, which is funded in part by the New York State Council for the Arts. But fortunately, being virtual means that we can welcome people from anywhere in the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Emma Copley Eisenberg, author of The Third Rainbow Girl, The Long Life of a Double, it's backwards, isn't it? You get it though. The Long Life of a Double Murder in Appalachia. Emma's fiction and nonfiction has appeared in McSweeney's, The New York Times, Granta, Virginia Quarterly Review, Tin House, Guernica, The New Republic, The Washington Post Magazine, Esquire, and others. The Third Rainbow Girl is her first book of nonfiction and was published earlier this year by Hachette. She lives in Philadelphia, where she directs Blue Stoop, a hub for the literary arts. Paul Whitlatch is an executive editor at Crown, an imprint of Random House. He's acquired or edited best-selling and award-winning books, including Liza Mundy's Code Girls, Alexis Akao's A Moonless Starless Sky, Andrew Yang's The War on Normal People, and Billion Dollar Whale by Bradley Hope and Tom Wright. He previously held editorial positions at Hachette, Scribner, and W.W. Norton. The Third Rainbow Girl is an incredible book. It's true crime reporting and memoir. It's painstakingly and thoughtfully researched and woven with personal reflections and commentary. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Emma and Paul. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Maybe I will kick things off with a question.
Yeah, sounds great.
This is really interesting for Emma and me because obviously we worked together very closely when I was at Hachette, my old position. Now I'm at Crown, which you might have caught from the intro, but we sort of get to ask each other questions of like the things that happened off stage, for each of us, either in our minds or in like our conversations, with Emma and her agent, or between me and among some of the other publishing people. But I think the natural place to start is just sort of how this book came to be. And for those of you who read Emma's bio, you may know that she has an MFA in fiction, and yet her first book was nonfiction. So Emma, do you want to like tell us like how you, a fiction MFA, came to write a first book that was nonfiction?
Totally.
And sort of the genesis, of why you sort of wrote this particular book.
Yeah, absolutely, and equally excited to ask many questions. Yeah, things that we didn't get to process in the moment, but are now getting to learn more about from each other. So, yeah, I indeed do have a fiction MFA and still write fiction, and I think that actually moving back and forth between fiction and nonfiction has been immensely helpful for the quality of both of those sort of modes for me. So yeah, I know many folks prior to this had some questions about getting an agent and all of things. And so I guess it's good to say that just no story, no two stories are the same in terms of people's path through all of this. But I was lucky to meet and decide to work with my agent, Jen Ah, who's at the Wiley Agency. Through my work in fiction, I was getting my MFA at UVA in Charlottesville. And so Jen took me on for stories, but over time and as the world was changing and living in Charlottesville, Virginia in the 2014, 2015 zone of time when many of the forces and rise of the alt-right that we've seen happen in the past couple of years was already starting to happen at that time. And the UVA Rolling Stone Rape on Campus article was published that year. And I just started feeling that I wanted, additionally, writing fiction also to kind of think about how to be a part of all these conversations that were happening. And so as I kind of opened the idea that I might write some nonfiction as well, this experience and time that I had spent in southeastern West Virginia, first as an AmeriCorps Vista worker or anti-poverty worker, and then just as a person and friend, started just coming back and knocking and wanting to be heard. And so I worked on the original reporting and material that would become the Third Rainbow Girl over the course of like 3 years after getting my MFA. I did do a very brief stint at NYU's literary portage program, which is a wonderful program, but I didn't end up graduating. I encourage people that dropping out of things can be extremely healing. So if you need to drop out of something, do it. That was my that was my decision. So yeah, I just continued to work on this book outside of any structure, really. And my agent was kind enough to roll with it and basically tell me many times that it needed to be revised and repackaged, and that I didn't yet know what the material was. So it took me like about 3 years before we submitted the proposal to you for me to decide like what I thought this book was actually about, and get it ready to a place where we could send it out.
So maybe that's a good segue, just before we get too deep into it, for you to just say something about what the book is about, and this, the book centers around, crime that happened several decades ago in West Virginia, the murder of these two, young women. But, Johnny alluded to the fact that this book is a little bit of a blend of some memoir elements, some true crime, some sort of, social reportage. And so maybe just say something about the crime that sort of is the hinge for the book.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so I came to the story because I was living in this contemporary place, but this community had experienced this very difficult trauma, not only the death of these two women who were coming as visitors to their county, but
this is in 1980, right?
1980, exactly. Yeah. Yes, good memory. So it's a very small community. A ton of people are coming from all over the nation for a Rainbow Peace Festival, if folks are familiar with the Rainbow people. And basically, yeah, these two outsiders, women who are not from there, were hitchhiking to the festival in this place that was essentially like randomly chosen by a group that also was not from the community. And they were killed very close to where the festival was held. They never arrived. And so it's a very small community, not known, not having a great reason to be covered by, national publications, but all of a sudden it was getting a lot of attention from, the New York Times was covering this story, and not in a good way. And so it created this, very long and very thorough and in some ways quite harmful investigation into the murders of these two young women that lasted, 12 years plus, almost 20 years. And that, not just the crime, but the investigation and the difficulties and the people that were, accused of these crimes, and all of the trauma that brought up was very present still when I was living there. And so but there's also a good deal of material in the book, like you mentioned, Paul, that's, I knew that I was not interested in writing like a whodunit of the case, and I didn't even feel that the case itself was necessarily the thing that we were going to learn from, but rather using the case as a kind of opening point to talk about the ways that stories dictate what happens later and repeat itself, and also the ways that Appalachia as a place, and West Virginia more specifically, and then this specific part of West Virginia, are really interesting places to look at stories that are told about Appalachia and about America.
Yeah. So, I mean, like the term true crime, I expect is going to come up in this conversation a little bit, but I mean, it's really my sense that like you did not go looking for a true crime story to tell. It just so happened there was a story about a crime that had a lot of layers to it that really fascinated you. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's sort of like cheesy and annoying, and people are like, oh, I didn't look for the story found me, but like kind of in this case. And I think it really did come from my ambivalence and real, questions about my own positionality as like serving quote unquote in AmeriCorps in this community, and the people that I've met, and the ways that our relationships became entangled in class and gender and violence, and trying to understand the contemporary really led me back to the past. So there's, there's a good amount of just trying to braid in an understanding of the present and this present community in this part of Appalachia into the past. And I think they're both equally there. I mean, I certainly understand why people see this book as true crime, but it's also, I think, writing about violence can be called a lot of different things too.
Yeah. So just like the mechanics of it. So eventually you find an agent, you sort of have this dialogue with an agent over many months, it sounds like, to kind of, revise a proposal. I don't remember in the end how long the proposal ended up being. Maybe it was about 50 pages.
Yeah, I think it was like a little on the longer end, like 65, something like that.
Yeah. And so what is there's just like a day where your agent says, okay, this is the draft that I'm going to submit to publishers. And is that kind of how it happens?
Yeah, well, many more years,
Okay.
plus 10 years. Yeah, there were many moments where I was like, I know what this book is. Like at first I thought it was going to be, yes, just the story of the past, just the historical elements. And then I realized, sort of like I was just saying, that that's just not the book I wanted to write. Like I wanted to write a book that was, that certainly contained an exploration of this crime, but also drew in all these other modes of reporting and of memoir. And so, so it took a lot of like expanding and then compressing again, expanding and then compressing again. So like I would sort of throw all these pages at my agent and she would be like, no. And I would be like, then a year would go by and I would rewrite the whole thing and I would be like, no, I totally know what the book is now. And she was like, no. So I think it was sort of like knocking 3 times at the rabbi's door. I think like my agent said twice no to the whole thing. And then on the third, I basically went on a retreat, actually in the same community in West Virginia with some friends, and sat there and really asked myself, like, this book is extremely multifaceted. It's extremely spanning in its form. Like, what is it that I really think is true about this story? Like, it's true about the murder, it's true about the place, it's true about me, like, what is it? And I just wrote this list of things called True Things, which is now in the book's finished form. It's beginning. And when I wrote that list, I really feel like I figured out what the book was about, but that took, 3+ years. So I came back finally to my agent the third time and said, I really think I know what it's about now. And here's this list. Yeah. And she said, I agree, like, let's try to sell it. And she was extremely helpful. Different people do it different ways, but my agent was extremely hands-on in terms of creating the proposal. So she took a lot of sort of, I think I still had, a multi-100-page draft, and she kind of Frankensteined in these different parts to highlight the different threads that we knew we wanted to be in the book. And the proposal did also include that strange true things section, as you know.
I see. So this is interesting. So there's a lot more than what I saw when I got the submission, which I didn't even, I mean, I sort of suspect that in many cases, but I don't think I ever heard that specifically in this case.
Totally. Yeah. And I guess I want to ask you too, like, I know you've said, we were kind of worried, like sending a submission out that starts with a strange list called True Things, like, yeah, it may not be for everybody. And like, we've talked about in the Creating This talk, like, it's hard to think about how to put out into the world a book that works in many forms. So I guess, what did you think when you got the proposal, or what was it that made you decide that you could see this as a book?
Well, I think one interesting distinction to just note, first is that, the big difference between, typically how, publishers will, will sort of accept submissions for fiction versus nonfiction is that fiction oftentimes comes in as a complete draft, whereas nonfiction is typically sold on proposal. And those proposals could be, in some cases, 15 pages, they could be 100 pages, typically not more than 100, but they're usually sort of a piece of it. So it's a little bit of a different process, from an editorial standpoint, because like, for a complete fiction manuscript, you're kind of like, I sort of have a sense, an underlying sense of, that like sort of loose verb, like to work, like, is this working or not? And then your sort of editing is kind of this like, retrofitting, tinkering that you're going to go back and sort of ask the author to do. Whereas like with nonfiction, if you get 50 pages of a book that you expect is going to be 250 or 300 pages, you're sort of projecting. So sometimes what you're projecting is like a little bit of an optimism bias about what you hope is going to be there once everything is said and done. But, so there's sort of a standard way that a lot of people tend to write nonfiction proposals. And you can find various guides on the internet that will tell you how to do this. And, usually it'll start with something like an overview. Then there'll be like chapter summaries and an outline. Usually there's a section on sort of the marketplace and competition that the author and agent perceive, books that either they think our book is in the vein of this book, or like this literally may be a book, say it's a newsy topic that could be a sort of a direct competitor to it. But, these sort of, the way these end up kind of looking is all over the map. I mean, nonfiction is a huge, macro genre, and you have everything in it from, reported journalistic works to platform and profile driven stuff, diet books, celebrity memoirs. And then you have, something like your book that is, kind of this blend of personal memoir, but with also kind of a reported aspect to it too. So you were, in some ways you were like breaking genre rules, which can be a good thing. I think if you're especially for those works that really have, kind of striving for a high literary quality. So for me, to open that document and not see overview, which sounds like in some ways like very cold, I got this, first page that said true things with this sort of numbered list that both kind of, led me into the facts of this sort of double murder from 1980, but also kind of immediately like complicated it and showed me the layers that your brain was going through in terms of processing it, in terms of, how gender plays out, sort of in violent crime, sort of facts about, sort of the social reality for people, in West Virginia and Appalachia. And specifically facts about this case, which went through this extraordinary history where it was kind of seemingly solved and then unsolved, and actions by law enforcement over the years kind of were slowly revealed, and then there's a known serial killer who confesses to the case. So it was sort of this clever way of kind of getting a lot of things out there that it could have seemed inelegant, and if it wasn't done really well. But the way you sort of wrote this list, it was like you were giving me like 20 breadcrumbs that just really were totally intriguing. But also, like, at the same time, you were giving me like a glimpse, both into kind of how your brain worked as a writer, and also, and I think this is really important, especially for those writers of nonfiction who are trying to write something that's more voice-driven, more literary. It was written in the style of what the book would be. Sometimes you read an overview and it's like, I don't know, it feels cobbled together, like it's not actually in the voice of the work. And yours was like, it immediately sort of put me in the right frame of mind. And I kind of knew this book was going to be like a little bit unusual, but I was like, I was totally compelled, to kind of read on at that point.
Oh, yeah. It was great because I feel like one thing that maybe we don't talk that much about is like there's this weird behind the scenes process with the sale where it's like when editors are in, if they open a document that's your proposal and they like it, then you have a phone call. And I felt like from the beginning, like we talked to a few different people who were like, it's dark, it's sad, it's West Virginia. And I was like, absolutely not. And Paul, like you had such a different read on the book, I think, from our original call, which was like you understood it was a weirder book and you were into that, which I felt like made me really confident about going with you as the editor. But I guess I wonder too, from your side of things, like did you know, I guess, when reading the proposal and then when you have to go back to your people and try to then buy it, like how did you talk to your in-house people at the very beginning about what you thought the book was or how you could see it fitting into your list, any of that?
Yeah. Well, I publish books that are both more literary and some that are, kind of more platform or profile driven, sort of in like politics and business. So I always think about like a stockbroker or something. I like to like have a portfolio that's like a little bit diverse, and I'd like to do a little bit of a few different genres. And I just, I think, sometimes it can be so fickle. It's like if you signed up something last week where you're like, oh, this could be a little too much like this, you might actually not find yourself as excited about something just by virtue of happenstance. But I don't know, for some reason I was primed for this book. I was really primed for something that would challenge me and be a little bit more literary. But your question's interesting because I think it's like at that very beginning of the process, like if the editor can start to formulate like a really like a pitch, to herself or himself that feels like it has kind of some potency to it, like right away, that's usually a good sign. And, it works a little bit different at every imprint, but, my old, company Hachette, I was at the Hachette Books imprint, and once a week, we would sit in this editorial meeting, and, sometimes like lots of emails would get exchanged outside the meeting if something was, moving quickly, as we say, but, really at this meeting is your chance to kind of like say, I have this project in, and I'm interested in it for these reasons. And it's funny, I mean, like, there are lots of like little, like salesman-like tricks you can employ. And this is like important because it's like in a weird way, like selling the book like starts to happen like internally. Like the editor is like selling the concept of the book to their colleagues, before like, and then it begins this like chain of basically pitching the book like at every level of the publishing company to the, sort of middle people at publishers and booksellers and industry groups that are very sort of influential, and then kind of eventually to the end, kind of reader consumer. But, I think this one, the pitch was definitely, it was writer led. I told people I thought the writing was really fascinating, and this sort of, but, I think that, what some people could look at and see as a detriment, oh, it's not true crime enough. Maybe it's not personal memoir enough. Like, there's just some people who are attracted to that hybrid, and that's, I think that's what makes publishing great, is like, there are these like very cookie cutter genres, but there are spaces out there, I think, for books that kind of sometimes don't fit into them. And this one to me was just like, it was so, I just was in love with the writing from day one. And I was able to kind of like, that's really what I led with. I do think there was this like secondary component even then of, we have been in this moment where I think like what sort of people in the cultural sphere think of as like true crime has kind of expanded and become more complicated. There are, like innumerable podcasts, like some that are really, being done that are kind of, focusing on racial injustices, in the criminal justice system, but also telling the story of decades old crime. So it did fit into a little bit of this, kind of, cultural phenomenon, I think that we've been in that, now has expanded, spans books, podcasts. Some of you probably saw the documentary version of Michelle McNamara's book that broadcast recently. So, I think that was helpful in a way. And I think that sometimes like, an editor, when they, like want to acquire something because they like selfishly think that they need to be the person to publish it, they'll use like these arguments, of like, let's point to this other thing that's really working as a way to sort of bolster their case, even if it's like not always like a one-to-one comparison.
Totally. No, that's helpful that you were like already priming the people in your colleagues that it was a little weird or it was complicated, but also that it was, it sounds like true crime as an expansive field, like including, Patrick Radden Keefe and including, Yellowbird, Sierra Crane Murdoch's book about crime on native reservations. Like, absolutely, it seems, yes, timing is always a part of it, perhaps.
So maybe we should talk about the editorial process a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's like, yay, you get a book deal. That's like really exciting. I mean, one thing that's very interesting to me about being a nonfiction editor is that the process does kind of like start a little bit as a dialogue, whereas like, if you sell a fiction manuscript, and I used to edit some of those, like maybe the first thing you do is like, okay, I bought the book, now I'm going to send you like a memo or something with all these notes. But it can kind of just like start with more like from a conversation in this case. But like, so you went off for a few, this process happens a little differently, but I think you kind of like went off for a few months and started working to kind of like flush out some of the early parts of the book.
Yeah, totally. I think, I feel like something I always want to talk about is money. And I should say that like, there's, especially if you're writing a reported book, like there's so many things that you may want to do, but like you don't have the money for until you sell the book. So there was a lot of reported material that I was kind of like, I will do this when I have the money. And the sale of the book, which you get usually a third, but sometimes a quarter, depending right on the place, allowed me to then finish the reporting. So I was kind of like, hold on, must go do a few things. And I flew to some, Florida and Iowa and different places, and then came back and started working. And I think I came to this place where I had a big pile of pages and material, and I had ideas about how I wanted to structure it, but they were a bit convoluted. And I felt like I guess I'm curious from your perspective too, like how did you find the structure that we eventually came to, which was 7 parts, and think about the threads and what kind of proportions to give to the threads? Because I had my own ideas, but I think you really helped me see the whole project.
Yeah, well, it was a little bit of trial and error. I think what we knew up front was that, there was going to be, piece of the book, that really focused on telling the story of the crimes and the legal aftermath, and really drawing on, transcripts that you found. I mean, you did an amazing job of like finding great stories from the local newspaper, that kind of like flushed out like the sort of the time period that you were talking about. But then it was like, okay, there are these memoir components that actually talk about you being sort of a New Yorker, coming to live in this place, and sort of, kind of almost like the meta story. And I kind of hate that term, but like in a way, like, sort of hearing about these events and processing it as someone who was then living there, but also as a way to talk about how like the legacy of this crime. And one of the things that the book is really, does, I think, so wonderfully is like show how this kind of crime came to sort of, hang over this town a little bit. And there was like a second and a third generation of some cases men who were implicated, and in some cases exonerated. But like it was just this sort of event that really, loomed large in like the town's imagination, came to loom large in yours. And so I think we had to figure out a way to kind of, like intrigue readers right away. It's like these days now more than ever, people can like sample a little bit of the beginning of an audiobook, sample a little bit of the beginning of an ebook, in addition to picking up a book at that bookstore and just paging through the first. So you really want to like, in the beginning of the book, True Things, I thought did an amazing job. And then it follows by chapter 1, where you kind of, you sort of begin like on a road, sort of like in this area in West Virginia. And you sort of use this sort of like, sequence of like driving down this road to actually talk about the land on each side of it, and sort of like how, West Virginia's kind of cultural history kind of came to be formed in a lot of ways. And then you sort of like end up at the very end of that chapter 1 with the discovery of these sort of 2 bodies. And I think that was like, I thought that was a great way to sort of like, show readers that this book would be sort of multi-layered. Like there were these bodies, and that was a bit, you had to sort of, deal with the consequence of there being this crime, but also like, hey, I'm gonna like really do some sort of deep work on cultural history and assumptions and that as well. And then we kind of like mapped it out, I think, over time and over a couple drafts where, a chapter that focused on the crimes would then sort of, you pull out and have a chapter that's a little bit more on sort of your immediate experience, then go into something else. And it was a balance. There are some books that it's obvious sometimes, like you're telling a straight chronology. You weren't. You were going back and forth between the events of 1980 and events, sort of more recently, but also with a layer of history. And it was, I don't know, it's hard to sort of describe that process except to say that it was like a little bit of a dialogue, and I remember telling you in some areas like, whoa, like we are like way too far into like legal transcript zone and like you need to like allow the reader to sort of come up for air, but I think the other thing about the 7 parts was that it allowed you to kind of make these like pivots and like allow the reader to kind of like take a breath. And I think sometimes like I really enjoy nonfiction where it's sort of, when it works on a couple different levels and it advances sort of one part of the story, then stops and sort of goes into something else and kind of, ends up forming this like multi-layered tapestry. But I think this played out over like a couple of memos and some phone calls, even before like I ended up like editing any individual sentence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I remember too. I think I had a lot of the parts, like sort of like for folks that use Scrivener, if you use note cards, like I feel like the equivalent was like I had many, many note cards, and I could I had the individual discrete sections of what I felt was the sort of more minute beats, but I think having an editor, and specifically having used the editor to look at the macro structure, was super helpful. And we did change, and go back and forth a lot. It was really important to me to not begin the book with the bodies of dead women, which I was very like adamant about. And I think, just because there is that, as we know, just this huge trope of books that we call true crime starting with bodies of, people that then are viewed as, not specific or not real people. And I wanted to make sure that the victims in this case got to be real people and not to be complicated and all of that. But I think, the first chapter, or the first sort of section after True Things, functioned as kind of like a mini microcosm of the book, because it really did focus on the place and on the history and many other elements. But it did, of course, like acknowledge the truth of like you said, the bodies there. I feel like, talking about the strands structurally makes me just think of many people who are working on multi-strand projects. And I think, the compromise we came to was that there are 7 parts in the book, and 2 of them are essentially me, or looking at contemporary Appalachia with me as the kind of guide, and then 5 of them are the history. So it's not a perfect one-to-one. I don't know, we talked about this too, but I was kind of resistant to like a back and forth structure, and I felt like you were helpful in suggesting different structures that were not that, because I feel like we see that a good amount, and I'm like, there's got to be other ways out there.
Yeah, well, that raises an interesting question. Like, so, in the course of our conversations and notes, I think I gave you a few suggestions that you did not agree with. What was that like? What was that like being edited? You know, it's like you've obviously at this point been working on this book for years. Here's this like editor who comes in and like has some opinions about it. Like what? Like I'm just like I'm from your shoes. Like how was it? What was it like to be kind of in the middle of that sort of process and sort of, you know, I guess find the right way to sort of like take sort of those editorial notes, but feel like you were remaining true to your vision for the book.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like it was hard because we always think we know best. And then there would be moments where you would suggest something and I would like be like, and then I would think about it for a day and I was like, oh, okay, like that is right. So sometimes I couldn't tell if it was my own knee-jerk reactions, like, what is the word? Like combative personality disorder, or if I have, but there were really moments where I was clear about certain things that I did and didn't want. And I think something that I was struggling with the whole time and that, we did a lot of different ways of thinking about and talking about is just thinking about my own positionality in relation to the story. I'm not from the place. I wanted to make that really clear up front. And I wanted to acknowledge, kind of expose myself in the same way that I was exposing other people in the contemporary sections. And yeah, so I think there were moments when I remember like a couple of moments about language, because again, I also am a fiction writer. Like I did something like playful or weird, or I think I said hot. I was like, hot young West Virginians. And you were like, hot? Is that really the word we want here? And I was like, yes, it is. Like, I really fought hard for the word hot there. And I think that there are a few moments where I feel like I wanted to preserve my voice even while tackling such a serious subject. And it like pains me sometimes when I see beautiful writers kind of tone down their own style, I think it's important to tone down our style. And there were moments when you suggested things like, this really isn't the right place to play with style. And I was like, that's right. Because we don't want the style to subsume the facts. But there are a few moments I did fight for, of course. And I did fight a little bit to keep my own, I didn't want it to be like a Michelle McNamara where it was like, and then I called this person and then I did that. Like I kind of wanted the reader to feel immersed in the looking out process as well. And so we did a lot of negotiation around that. Yeah.
So over many rounds, we go back and forth on the manuscript, and eventually it gets to this point where we say, okay, like, we're going to hand it over to the copy editor now to begin this production process. There are a few interesting things that maybe we should just touch on. One is sort of a legal read, because in this case, you were writing about, real people. And so that's something that, sort of happens at that when you're sort of finished with the manuscript, but then also fact checking, which is something that you recently wrote this great piece in Esquire about, kind of exploring the sort of complicated process of how do you fact check, a nonfiction book. So do you maybe want to address those two parts of the process?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, having an editor who's really on your team and like gives you a sense of what's coming up was super helpful, which you very much were. And I feel like, pretty much the legal reads role is to protect everybody, is to protect me as much as it is to protect Hachette or whoever the publisher is. But yeah, I know people that have had a variety of different experiences, some of them super, super grueling and some of them, less grueling. And it definitely, I think most of what the lawyer did, who was actually really great and like a big fan of the book, which has been a delight. She basically just made sure that we were giving everyone who would ever want to say anything in response to anything I'd written in the book, just, very, very many, plentiful opportunities to comment and to know that the book was coming out and to say anything that they might want to say and be included in the book. And I did a good amount for better or worse, and different reporters and journalists do have different systems but basically everyone who's in the contemporary sections read the book beforehand, and I didn't change every single thing that people asked for, but I did say I value what you have to say. And so it was a balancing of all of those opinions, I guess. But basically the lawyer's role is just to make sure that it's all true in terms of what can really hurt people or what can hurt the writer. And that made me feel extremely held and protected, which was good for sleeping at night. And then the fact checking, is something near and dear to my heart, because I think it's at the crux of what we do as nonfiction writers. And for those of us that come and work in magazine journalism or work in online journalism, like it's just so de rigueur to be fact checked, and it's such a gift to be fact checked, like to have someone spend so much time with your work. But just to reiterate, or for folks that haven't seen me like proselytizing about this on Twitter, like it, you know, you are responsible as the author for the truth in your book. So that's what you sign in your contract, you know, that I will put forth a book that is true. And that means a lot of work, and it means a lot of work for you, the author, and or a lot of work for a fact checker. So I did hire my own, and I feel just so grateful that the advance from Hachette was enough to do that. I know that a lot of folks would love to do that, but it's not possible if you're with a smaller press. So that's definitely something to consider in terms of the kind of reporting folks may want to do and the kind of place your book ends up. But yeah, I worked really collaboratively with my fact checker, and it was terrible, and it was awful, and it was time consuming, and it was like the best thing ever, because once that happens, you know, people find so many errors, and they find just really important errors of logic too, because, you know, Paul would find things, like the copy editor finds things, but to have someone who's really thinking about the veracity of the text is, I think, just super important. And yeah, but I wonder from your side too, like I was off working with the fact checker, you know, thinking through the last final things, but what happens for the editor in-house when the manuscript comes back and is like, let's go?
Well, it is interesting, you know, there's sort of all this offstage stuff that editors are doing that the authors don't necessarily see, and may not always like let the authors kind of like, you know about. But you know, well before the book is published, sometimes a year or more, you know, we begin this process of kind of like promoting the book to our sales force. You know, the meetings have different names at different houses, but, you know, essentially we launch a list internally. Like imagine like a fashion line launching its like, you know, spring 2021 list. Like that happens well in advance, you know, and so you're sort of filling out all this paperwork. You're literally giving a presentation nowadays on Zoom, but previously in rooms of, you know, 100, 150 people. And that's sort of really the moment where, you know, like you as an editor kind of, you know, you're thinking like being an editor, you're sitting alone in a room, you know, with a manuscript, you know, making notes, but there's also this like very sort of, you know, kind of these outgoing qualities to the job that you know, may come naturally, or you may need to try to master over time, where you're sort of doing salesmanship around your list. But so that's been going on the whole time, you know, and you're sort of, you know, the process can be so kind of like one-to-one for so long with author and editor, and the agent, of course, is sort of the third part of that triangle. But then gradually, like at that point, the conversation begins to shift to like, okay, the book's done. Like, how are we gonna, you know, bring this book out into the world? And at most publishers, then the author would begin to meet other people from the team, you know, often a publicist, usually a marketing person, sometimes a few others. And, you know, often it's over a series of meetings. You sort of talk about the ideas you have, and there are these sort of tried and true things, you know, that we try to do with a lot of our books. Like one of them, you know, especially for more literary books, was, you know, make a big effort to indie booksellers who, although they represent, you know, a small fraction of sales, can have an outsized importance in terms of what books are being talked about and sort of their cultural tastemakers. So, you know, we made a big effort to kind of get early galleys to key indie bookseller readers. The book became an Indie Next list pick, which was awesome. And, you know, so every month they come out with this list of about 10 books or so that sort of get this, you know, this recognition. So there's all these sort of things like that we're sort of trying to do in this process. You know, at a certain point with, you know, it goes from being a manuscript that's copy edited, then to being proof pages that actually resemble the final book. And at that point, you know, the publishers make galleys, which could be either physical or e-galleys. There's a great program called NetGalley where you can, you know, securely read galleys online. And, you know, the publisher, in conjunction with the author, is trying to figure out, like, who do we need to get this book in front of, you know, to kind of raise awareness. And there's sort of the side of it that's sales, you know, not just with indies, but like how many copies is Barnes & Noble going to take? Like, you know, for some books, can we get this book into Target or Costco or airports? You know, and then it's, you know, sort of all these other people like, you know, early trade reviewers, you know, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, you know, and then there's sort of like a whole nother list of publicity targets, some which you go to earlier than others. You know, and on top of that, you know, what unique ideas are we going to have in terms of, you know, digital marketing specifically for this book? You know, is there something in the author's background that we could kind of like play off of? You know, is there publishers, especially nowadays, are like, okay, we're doing virtual events. Can we take this, you know, author that we just signed up, put them in conversation with another author that we already publish, try to kind of, you know, get these audiences to pay attention to other works? So there's, you know, there's all sorts of ideas, and the editor is kind of in the middle of all this, you know, and like is always trying to be like the liaison, you know, to the author to like explain things. You know, it's like you're sort of like speaking out of both sides of your mouth on one hand, because you're like a representative of your company, and sort of you want your books to succeed, and you want to have great relationships with all the important people at the company whose work is kind of unseen but so crucial to the process. But then you're also trying to be your author's advocate, and talking to your author and agent. So it's a complicated process, and it's really one that's like hard to teach. And I was lucky to have good mentors over the years that kind of showed me like kind of what it took, I think, to really be this great advocate for your authors, and also be like a good coworker to people and publishers. But it's a complicated process that draws on different skills. But I think in your case, like the book ended up really having this sort of great life. It continues to sell, and the pieces came together. I think one thing, it's kind of, maybe you can speak to this before we turn it over to questions, but one thing I always think about with authors is like it's hard, because you've worked on this thing for like years, and then there is like a day when it just comes out. And it's like, sometimes if you're, you might have, an event that day. If you're super lucky, like maybe you get a big review that comes out like around that day, but like these days it's hard to, the media has such a limited attention span. We're trying to get as much as we can, reviews, radio, maybe TV for some books, but it's hard to line all these things up, especially if you're not a repeat bestseller. So like what was that like actually to like have that moment finally arrive, like when it's like, okay, the book, you can now go to Barnes & Noble or to, IndieBound or wherever and order a copy of it?
It was so weird. Yeah, absolutely strange. And I think like what you spoke to also makes me think that like, right, especially for on the writer's side, like indeed you labor on this strange object that is first just yours, and then it's yours and your editors, and then it's yours and the sales team. Like you said, there were so many other people behind the scenes who are so key in terms of shaping the way the book was going to be talked about. And I think it's tough, because like there were moments like we had this great sales meeting where it was like me and you and the director of marketing at Hachette and the publisher, and my agent also came, which was lovely. It's nice to have your agent there as like your sort of comfort person. And that was like when you talked about like how the book would be sold, and that was definitely, I think, the first time I remember hearing the phrase true crime, or maybe it was like we had talked about the phrase true crime before. But it's strange. It's like a strange moment where your book becomes this, it's no longer an isolated thing. It's like now it's an object of capitalism, and you also become an ambivalent parent, because I was like, well, if you guys say like that, putting these words on it will help it to find its way into the hands of more readers, like I'm all for that. And then there's another part of me that's like, but she's complex, she cannot be reduced to like this one thing, like I think it's a strange ambivalent birth for a lot of writers, where you're like, you want your book to make its way into the broadest possible hands, but also you have ideas about how you want to talk about it. And so it is a big exercise in letting go oftentimes, and then there were certain things that I was like, I really want it to be talked about this way, and I really don't want a sad Appalachian house on it. I want to fight against those kinds of stereotypes. So yeah,
you mean on the cover design,
on the cover, yeah. Which we don't have, which is lovely. And I think like I think there's just a lot of different allegiances that play out in that moment of having the book come out, and yeah, just kind of letting it be an object that people will then put, hopefully, if all goes well, put on their nightstands and then put a cup of coffee on, and it's no longer so precious anymore, but in this way that's extremely strange. So yeah, it's a huge letting go. And I also would say I had a cool group of other authors who are publishing their books for the first time, or a few people who had published their books like a year before, who were giving me helpful support. So I'd also totally recommend that. Yeah, but I know
should we turn it over?
Yeah, I know there's so many people who want to ask stuff, so thank you.
All right, yes, we have plenty of questions. Hello again.
Hi.
All right, so first of all, we received plenty of questions about how you found your agent and challenges you might have experienced finding an agent and pitching this book to an agent.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, again, like so many people do it such different ways. I think, yeah, I did go the traditional MFA route to some extent, even though, again, my agent didn't take me on for the exact work I was doing at that time. I think it's really lovely to have an agent who will shift with you as you shift, because oftentimes you make these promises to work with someone when you don't really know, again, what your project is. So yeah, I think the challenges there are just like managing that relationship like any other relationship. And I'm extremely grateful to have someone who has my, just all the stuff that I would never know to think about. And like my agent led me to like Paul, like your agent is the way to really find a home for your book at first in an editorial way. So they kind of have to know like who would be a good person to send this book to, like would Paul like this kind of thing. So I think that's extremely important. And but I also know friends who found their agents through just cold querying, or who just did a lot of work reading books and then seeing who represented that book that they love and then following up with them that way too.
Or maybe some who just published something, you know, like an article or a piece, and then the agent found them. You know, that's like sometimes what I say when I hear that question, it's like, it's not just about finding the agent, it's like, what can you put into the world, you know, sort of short form wise that might actually get somebody to read it and get in touch with you.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. And what about working with the editor? Did you choose Paul, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's kind of like in a weird way like speed dating when you go on those calls. Like I had to choose Paul and Paul had to choose me. We had to both agree, to this working relationship. So yeah, like we were touching on earlier, like yeah, if you send the manuscript out, your agent does, to various editors who they think it might be a good fit for, and then if best case scenario you have one or even a few editors who are interested. I think we did like maybe 8 or 10 calls with people who were interested in the book, and then you kind of get to listen to like who they are and what they think the book will be. And again, like I feel like Paul's vision for the book was the most in line with how I saw the book too, and so it was a good serendipity.
Mm-hmm. What about the fact checkers? Some people were asking how you chose the particular fact checker you chose, and also were there any interesting errors that the fact checker caught?
So many errors. Yes, I would refer you to my case at www.esquire.com. I really go into it because this, again, is close to my heart. But yeah, basically, it's a bit of a wild west with hiring a fact checker because, like many writers who like hustle a lot of different kinds of work to make a living, many fact checkers are also journalists who do this on the side, or if you're lucky to work with a seasoned fact checker who's worked on books before. I probably could have gone to Paul too and been like, can you recommend someone? I'm sure that your editors or even my agent probably could have fixed me up with a fact checker as well. But I think you just want to look for, I actually am not remembering the exact figures down, but in my article, I talk about kind of a going rate that I found based on a lot of research that I've done about the people that do this kind of work. So kind of getting a sense of what the going rate is, I think, is really key because it can be a huge, huge range. And then also just being really clear with your fact checker about what you want them to do. Like, do you want them to call and check quotes? Do you just want them to check the research? Yeah, and my fact checker found so many things. And yeah, I think sometimes people say like the biggest errors are the hardest ones to catch yourself. Not from any fault of like the Hachette side, but things about, where rivers are, like who amongst us can say where the Ohio River flows with any great detail? But that's what fact checkers are for. Yes.
Paul, do you have a wish list, or what do you like to acquire?
It's pretty broad. I think you sort of bring, I think like your passions and interests to it, but sometimes like what I just did when I changed jobs and I went to work at Crown, you also sort of figure out how you fit into, a group of editors. I mean, that's sort of what's interesting is, you have your individual list as an editor, but you're also kind of part of an editorial team and an imprint that has a little bit of, of an identity. So when I started out, I was working at Scribner for the first several years of my career, which was a very kind of like fiction forward place, a lot of debut literary fiction, everyone up to sort of people like Stephen King. And now I'm at a place that only publishes nonfiction. So I've evolved a little bit over time. My interests have evolved. I've always published a little bit of political nonfiction. I mean, you do follow the marketplace sometimes a little bit, and that's obviously been a genre that, has done exceptionally well over the last couple of years. So I think it's always a good idea if you're an editor, an aspiring editor, to kind of, have a piece of your list that is, almost or mostly passion, And then a piece of your list are books where, you know, you sort of see the market for them, and you're curious about the topics and want to work on them, but you know, they may not be the books that you necessarily like go to on the proverbial deserted island. So, you know, I would say, like, you know, Emma's book was like very squarely in that sort of passion zone. It was just a great reading experience. It's the kind of book I would pick up in the bookstore. You know, and then, you know, but sometimes I bought books that are like, you know, about, you know, interesting ideas in the world. Like you mentioned the fact that I published Andrew Yang. You know, I didn't publish Andrew Yang because he was a presidential candidate. At that time, nobody really knew who he was. But he was an interesting person talking about universal basic income, which I thought was like this very interesting idea. It was a sort of a solution to some, you know, these sort of economic trends we've been seeing. And I sort of fell in love with the idea a little bit. He was such a charismatic spokesperson. And then, you know, it was interesting, you know, having worked with him for a couple of years to like see his public profile evolve, you know, sort of over time. So it's always a little bit different. But one thing I try to do a little bit too is be really proactive about what I sign up. So, you know, I said, like, you know, think about what you're putting in the world that might attract someone. I oftentimes, you know, find things out there where I see writers who write a piece that I'm interested in, and I reach out to them. And sometimes they have an agent, sometimes they don't. I've referred people to agents before. On a few occasions, I've actually signed up things that were unagented, although those are very much the exception. But you know, you sort of never know, like, where you're going to sort of find something. But I like to keep a very sort of an open mind. But you know, a lot of my books are sort of journalism, memoir, politics, business, and ideas.
We should probably touch on the pandemic and the effects of that. Do you see acquisitions changing in response to the pandemic, or is it too hard to predict what'll be getting published? You know,
people have really been buying books. You know, both readers buying books and you know, with everything else canceled in our lives, there's been a lot of reading time, and I think publishers are pretty happy that we've you know, there was a fear, you know, in you know, April, that things, I think, were going to really fall. And I think you know, with you know, there have been shifts in different kinds of books. I think it's been a hard time to publish debut books, you know, because there's so much, I think, energy, you know, around like, I'm gonna, you know, even if I'm just talking to like 15 people at, like, you know, my like mom's book club, it's like, you know, you really want to feel like you can kind of get out there. And I think it's been constraining for a lot of authors to feel like, you know, they're only sitting behind their computer right now to try to sort of promote their books. So like, that's a little hard, but I mean, publishers have been adapting, have been trying to put on, you know, great virtual events just like this one, where fortunately, like, the bar of entry is lower. You know, you don't have to be in a certain place to drive up or walk up and attend, you know, a certain session. In terms of acquisitions, you know, I think everyone, especially in nonfiction, I mean, like, everyone is waiting for this election to be over, kind of. You know, I think, I mean, that, you know, Trump publishing is just kind of like, you know, like, infected so much of the dialogue, you know, about sort of what books have been really selling over the last couple of years. And that's not to say that, like, interesting narrative nonfiction and memoir hasn't been selling, but I think where we've felt a little bit of a squeeze is in, like, the media venues to sort of promote books. And there's been sort of so much brain power that's gone to covering, you know, the sort of day-to-day, like, you know, sort of travails of this current administration and all of its consequences, that, you know, even places like NPR that have traditionally been very book friendly, you know, just feel like there's so much Washington news that they have to cover that it's like they're not, you know, it's a little harder sometimes, I think, to get those hits. You know, it's always been hard to get the New York Times, but I think that's the media part of it has always been kind of hard, but you know, we keep trying.
And for you, Emma, what's the life of the book been like this year? I mean, I guess you had a little time for promotion before the shutdown.
Exactly.
It's been crazy.
Yeah, it came out right in the before times, and then I was in Austin, Texas when the, like, after times became real. And yeah, it was a huge, I think that whole middle swath of, like, probably just the month of March and April maybe, it, you know, it was sad. You felt grief and loss for, like, you know, the whole second half of tour events, like things that my publicist, who was awesome, like, had worked really hard to set up. Like, there's loss there for sure, but I feel like, yeah, I felt like there was also a lot of strange openings and splittings and fracturing that made cool stuff happen. Like, I think the more that we kind of try to approximate what would have been before the pandemic, it feels sadder, and the more we kind of embrace what is possible now that wouldn't have been possible before, like Paul was saying, feels, you know, more energetic. And I got to be part of a really cool book launch for a friend who was a debut author. We basically just, we took her canceled event online, and it was sort of like a literary slumber party. Like, it was more intimate than it would have been probably, at Books Are Magic, which is where it's supposed to be. And I felt like some of the events that I did also felt that way, like a strange, even now you're like, you're in my office and my pottery is here and my books are here. Like, there is a certain strange sense of intimacy, but I think you have to be a person who likes that or is willing to lean into it. And I think for debut authors, like, fortunately, are sort of like what Paul was saying, like, if you're a person who does really well with chatting and being open and vulnerable, like, it can be a lot of fun. And I've had a lot of fun talking to book clubs virtually, and friends and colleagues. Like, I talked to the UVA, like, alumni association the other day, and that all was really fun and might not have been possible because definitely publishers are, not wanting to send authors on events that may or may not be fiscally worth it. So certainly digital events all over the country, or through bookstores all over the country, have been possible in a way that I know it can be hard for publishers to sign up to do that. So yeah, I think more vulnerability and intimate events, and maybe we just skip the parts that feel like we're trying to reproduce what could have been.
A lot of people have questions about social media, both in how to promote a book and in the importance of an author already having a platform in order to sell a book. So either of you have thoughts on?
I will say that I was amazed at sort of seeing sort of Emma like evolve on Twitter. It's like funny to say, but like, I think you were already like sort of a Twitter user, I think, when I acquired the book, but I think you sort of did a really great job of just kind of developing a community digitally that like had like a real world like reflection to it. And I think that like publishers for like the last 10 plus years have been like, oh yeah, you gotta like get on Facebook and get on Twitter, but it's like, if you're not doing it well, like, it doesn't matter. I think what was important in Emma's case, I was just so impressed by, is like, you sort of developed the people who were engaged and interested in you by being engaged and interested in other people, and it was really that sort of like two-way street. And you kind of, you obviously can't, you knew people from your MFA program, but you really sort of seemed to me, and you should speak to this, but like developed a lot of connections, like, via Twitter. There is book Twitter, and people are having interesting conversations about, what's going on, and you were partaking in those. And so like, naturally over the course of time, people are like, who is this Emma Eisenberg? And like, what's her book about?
Totally. Yeah. I feel like I think one helpful thing was like so I guess like just to briefly flesh it out a little bit more, like when your book is in that stage of like about to be going out into the world, like Hachette gave me this really long list of like a survey of like, yeah, tell us everything about you, anything that could be helpful to promote the book basically. And I think a question on there was like, what platforms do you generally like to use, like genuinely for you, what makes sense? And I was definitely like Twitter, because I feel like, I don't know, I just have great fun on Twitter. And I feel like I know people are like, it's a hellscape. And like, definitely there are times, but I feel like it's 87% just great fun for me, because I just genuinely follow people who I think are interesting, and I unfollow people who do not spark joy. And I feel like they're, I read, the paper in the morning, and then I don't really get political news from Twitter. Like that's, so and I think I went to a talk once at AWP, the writers conference that was sort of no more this year because of the pandemic. And I think it was Rob Spillman and other folks from Tin House who have a really lovely Twitter and Instagram presence too, saying like a good sort of rule of thumb is like, for every one thing you want to share about yourself or you're asking people to like or do for you, you should put out 5 sort of genuine, interesting things for other people. So it can be like 1 book thing to like 5 cat photos, which I have copious amounts of, or it could be like 1 book thing for like 4 retweets or interesting, like I don't ever like retweet something that I'm like, oh, I must do this, but like there's just
you're also an expert in ice cream across America, and you talked a lot about like who has the best ice cream, and that's like a weird, like nothing to do with your book, but like it actually did, like it was sort of weirdly got people like interested in talking about something else. Yeah,
who doesn't love ice? I mean, right, I feel like you have to just like think about like, what do you genuinely care about? And for me, that truly is ice cream, and like try to just like lean into that and see like who else is out there that likes the strange things you do. And then I think it's like rising tide lifts all boats. Like lifting up other people's work that you genuinely like, and conversing with people that you're genuinely interested in about topics that are not books, I think lifts the writing too.
I would say, like, for my part, I'm not much, I don't put a lot out onto Twitter, except usually like good news about authors that I work with. But I've found a couple of books, and writers, like, they originated, via Twitter for me. I saw there's a book that was published today by Hachette, Culture Warlords by Talia Lavin, who's this sort of, has an amazing Twitter presence. But her book is about, sort of white supremacy online. And, she was just this, like, outspoken, really interesting Twitter presence. And I like DM'd her. And then that's, eventually, like, I got a proposal from her agent, but that's how that, first contact started. So it is, you should know, like, when you're out there on Twitter, there are people like me who are sort of snooping around and like, trying to find things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as long as it's authentic, like, it sounds like you were genuinely interested. She was genuinely putting out what she was doing. And yeah, I feel it can't be faked, but it's like, if you're open to sharing, what you care about, that will attract the people who care about the same thing. And I think it's fun. And other people do Instagram. I'm terrible at Instagram. I don't have a Facebook. Like, I think choosing one is enough because it's exhausting.
Well, back to the book. Some people were wondering about whether you got liability insurance. Any thoughts about changing names, combining characters, and what was the reaction of residents of Pocahontas County to the book?
Yeah, I feel like I did consider liability insurance, which can come through the Authors Guild, which I did inquire about, I remember, and that was helpful to just have that option there. I think ultimately I talked about it with Paul and with my agent, Jen. I think actually it was my agent who said, like, Emma, is everything in the book fake? And I was like, no. And she was like, then you don't need that liability insurance. That's a simplification, but I think liability insurance is, it's certainly helpful if you find yourself in a really difficult position where something is going out that is really wrong or not correct. And I'm sure it can be useful in other situations too that I'm not as intimately familiar with. But in this case, having the support of Hachette and the support of the Hachette lawyers and the legal read was enough to make me feel like there was good peace of mind and we were safe as much as one can be in writing difficult and potentially controversial material. So I didn't end up taking that option. But I think it can be, especially for journalists who do freelance and don't have a home with a book, with a publisher rather. I think liability insurance can be a really good thing. And I might consider it for the future if I continue to do like longer magazine pieces for different outlets. Yeah, we did change names, sometimes at request, sometimes at lawyer advice, sometimes just as a respect measure if I wasn't sure, how, if it didn't seem necessary to put the person's name in terms of that kind of exposure, but it was important that they add something to the text. Like, I think I essentially erred on the side of respect because it is a small community. I would say that the reaction from Pocahontas County has been mixed in the truest sense of that word, which is that there have been some very totally reasonable and deep and wise criticisms made of the book that I have engaged with pretty openly, and was honored to be on the West Virginia Public Radio program where I got to speak to some folks more directly and just have a really good conversation about people's concerns. And I feel like my position has always been I will retweet those critiques and totally talk about them as openly as possible. And then there's also been some really cool, amazing, positive feedback about, just the way that the book felt aimed at an in-group or aimed at the sort of broader Appalachian diaspora, like people that either live in the broader state of West Virginia or broader Appalachia, or perhaps have moved away, or their families from Appalachia, but they don't live there. I think I tried to speak not from the place of I'm from there, because obviously I'm not, but from an experience that's kind of not quite away. There's a lot of people who kind of occupy that middle space of not knowing how to engage with some kind of feeling of being attached to an Appalachian history or community. And I was, came in and then left, and that's my truth. And many people, I think this idea of diaspora is really relevant, because a lot of people were like, I miss it or I want to learn, or I've never had someone talk about that feeling of not quite being from, but missing this place that you don't know if you can claim. So yeah, I felt like there was just a lot of positions and different people from all over that spectrum who gravitated to the book too, and that was surprising.
Do you have any tips for tracking down people for interviews?
Well, I think because I had lived in the place as a person, that was really helpful. And I did ask several people to kind of go with me or connect me to people who would feel more comfortable having them there, or having some kind of trusted connection, lead to the interview rather than just like a cold call out of nowhere. I think also like something that we actually did during the legal process was kind of cool. Like I basically sent letters to everybody who was alive, who I hadn't been able to speak with yet, and just said like, there's one more opportunity if you ever want to tell me anything. And I used actually like the fax to letter like system, because I'm like, who has an envelope all the time? I don't. And several people actually responded to the snail mail, which isn't something I would have thought. And especially in rural communities, I think, where broadband access is a big issue. That's another thing that I feel is really important to say, is that like not everyone in rural places have access to high-speed internet and are checking their email all the time. So I think snail mail can actually be, and like Go US Postal Service, like it can be a great way to kind of give someone that last check. Like you're like, they won't answer their mail, but like people do.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked what comps were used, and how did you come up with your elevator pitch, Paul? Or did you two work on that together?
I'd be curious, like, what comps were used in the marketing stuff too.
That's a good question. It's been a couple of years probably since I came up with that list initially. I mean, one trick on the pitch is that, sometimes, when an agent sends, a submission first in, like they sort of write a cover letter, and it's like, it's not like sort of likely that there might be some great line in that cover letter that like 2 years later will actually end up in the final flat copy of the book. So sometimes like there's almost like a little seed of that from the very beginning, because like obviously the agent's done a good job of sort of processing it, and then you can kind of like pick that up and run with it. I'm trying to think like, I mean, I think at some point, the Michelle McNamara book came out. I think like The Fact of a Body was something we talked about a little bit.
He put that in the proposal because that was like a book that did combine the memoir aspect. Not that other books had never done that, but it's a more recent one. Yeah.
Robert Kolker's book, Lost Girls, about the women who were killed by a serial killer on Long Island. Yes, there were kind of like a handful of that. I mean, some were a little bit more from the sort of memoir space, and some were a little bit more from the space of journalism. And I had to kind of, because I mean, it's like I think sometimes the trap of comps is like, a book can be good because there's no book exactly like it, but then like if you're thinking in this like very like linear sales mentality, it's like, I want to see that like a book exactly like this has sold, an amount of copies that will justify my profit and loss statement. So like it's sort of the editor's job to like kind of navigate that a little bit. And I think, in this case, we kind of had a little array of comps that touched on, those two like, genres that we were making a hybrid of to some extent.
For sure. Yeah. And I think I like threw in some weirder ones in the probably original talked with Jen, my agent. And then I don't know how many of those were passed along, but I think I definitely mentioned like the Maggie Nelson, the Red Parts, and
oh yeah, for sure,
the Garden of Good and Evil, probably. There's some other
was Carmen Maria Machado's book out at that point yet too? I mean, that was certainly something I think by the time that we published it. I mean, it's just like they're the comps that exist when you buy the book, and then sometimes there's a year and a half where you're like, oh, this thing that came out 6 months ago, like, let's keep this in mind. So comps can be like a little bit of an evolving thing throughout the process, and of, limited use.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Someone mentioned that they're going to pick up a copy of The Third Rainbow Girl, even though she doesn't normally read true crime. And I would say I concur. I'm not a true crime.
Just don't think of it as true crime. It'll be fine.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot more than that. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up, but we'll email everyone with a link to a video if you missed some of it. And maybe we'll include a link to Emma's Esquire piece on fact checking. I'm sure a lot of people want to read that. And someone asked, Emma, what are you working on now?
Yes. Yeah, read the pandemic. I mean, I think things were slow, but we did sell 2 fiction books during the pandemic in May. So I have a novel and stories coming out sometime 2022, 2024, probably. Yeah, I'm trying to write a novel while all of us endure this strange, strange time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, so I do recommend the book, The Third Rainbow Girl, and specifically, if you want, you could support Emma's local bookstore, The Head and the Hand. So do an internet search for that. I think we've got the link up on our website as well. But Paul, Emma, thank you so much for being here. This has been really enlightening and covered so much really smoothly. This was great.
Thank
Well, it was really a fun conversation, and thank you so much for having us.
For sure.
Of course.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye. See you all.